So I've just had one thing on my mind. What is the most standard structure of a Sonic game? As in, the structure of the zones and how they are divided into their acts and bosses. Sonic 1 has 3, with a boss at the end of the third act. Sonic 2 and Advanced 1 have 2, with a boss at the end of the second act. 3 and Mania have 2, with the bosses at the end of every act. CD, Advanced 2, Heroes, the Rivals games, and the Rush games have 2 with a dedicated boss act. Heroes just gives Act 2 its own name though, that's nice. Advanced 3 and Sonic 4 have 3 acts plus a dedicated boss act. Generations has 2 acts per zone plus 10 side missions each, and also 2 bosses for every 3 zones. Unleashed has the day and night stage for each zone, and while there are other numbered acts for each character, since it's only the first one of each that's really mandatory and doesn't have a gimmick like making 3 laps around a short course for example, it's effectively 2 main acts per zone plus side missions. Also a separate boss act for each zone, except for Empire City. Of course exceptions to the game's respective structures exist, but they're typically near the end of the game for the final few zones for the purpose of focusing on the story a bit more, so I'm not taking those into account here. In any case, we can see the most common pattern here is the 2 acts plus a boss, which over half the games I've mentioned follow precisely, and much of the rest follow a close variation of such. Now, of course, not taking into consideration the games that don't even attempt to follow a structure like these and instead do their own thing, such as there is one game that almost certainly follows a structure like this, but does so in a rather peculiar way. You read the title, it's Sonic Colors. In this game, every zone has 6 acts plus a boss. And yet, not every one of these acts are equal. Some are significantly shorter than others, some take place exclusively in 2D, some clearly double back on the areas already seen in previous acts, and some have some really gimmicky stuff that, as per tradition with gimmicky Sonic levels, break the overall pace of the experience. Now, I'm far from the first person to notice this, but I've researched this game inside and out and noticed quite a deal of misinformation online about what I've found, such as every act loads from one giant level, which is simply not true. So I think it's time for a comprehensive analysis of exactly how this came about and hopefully paint a better picture of what this game may have looked like on the cutting room floor. Yes, Sonic Colors was originally going to follow the structure of 2 acts and a boss, plus side missions. How do I know this? Well, I'm going to show exactly that in the rest of this video. If we take a look in the game's files, you'll see a bunch of folders like this that all begin with STG, followed by 3 numbers. And oh, the first digit goes from 1 to 7. There's 7 zones in the game, makes sense. But what's this? Each one of these has a folder where the second digit is either 1, 2, or 9. The third digit is nothing, by the way. So if this is where stages are stored, then that must mean there's 2 main sets of data, so 2 main acts, plus an outlying one, so perhaps the boss act? So the data is all laid out as 2 acts, plus a boss. Huh. Well, that's all well and good, I hear you say, but you can't say that means the game was ever going to follow that structure, that's all just speculation, right? Boom. This file. actstgmission.lua confirms all of my speculation. It's a script file which tells the game what data to load for each stage, the object layouts, terrain, music, all that good stuff. However, the developers left in some comments, in Japanese, describing exactly what each stage is. This kanji right here, this is what this entire video is writing off of. We can translate it as old, as in former or earlier iteration. So take a line of this and we can read it as Act 1, the first half of the old Act 1. Every single stage has a comment like this that proves each of these folders correspond to a single full-length act as of this early iteration of the game. And in the final game, multiple acts may load from the same terrain dataset. And these gimmicky missions, they instead have their own unique names describing their gimmick and possibly what their name would have been had they been separated from the main acts, like in Generations or... Also, while I'm sure there's some story behind half the bosses being copies of the other bosses in the game, I got nothing to say about those, so yeah. Side note, it's pretty well known that some of the Game Land stages somewhat resemble stages from Sonic 1, and this file confirms this and then some. I've translated and put them on the screen, but in summary, it's all a collection of remixed sections of stages from Sonic 1, Unleashed, and the main Game of Colors. So, without further ado, it's finally time to go through every single act and mission and show exactly how they relate to this earlier, more traditional structure that we didn't see in the final game. Also, I'm going to be naming the stages as per their initial iteration. It's a little hard to explain, but you'll see what I mean. Act 1 was split and turned into Acts 1 and 2. This is actually why the first cutscene begins after Act 2 rather than Act 1, because this area here was supposed to be the end of Act 1 to begin with. It's apparent that most work was done on this stage to make it less obvious they're originally meant to be 1, since this blue chamber of sorts completely isolates the end of Act 1 from the beginning of Act 2. There is what appears to be a door that, while just a flat texture here, if it were to be opened it would lead straight to Act 2 like so. Act 2 was moved to Act 3. No split here, the act just starts at the start and ends at the end. Act 4 is a remix of the first 2D section of Act 1. Fun fact, this stage is actually called Jugenu, which is the Japanese name for the Mario enemy Lakitu, the name clearly referencing the name of this Lakitu-like guy that later got the name of Sprinkler. Act 5 is a remix of Act 2, making use of the laser wisp and these target objects that never appear anywhere else in the game. Act 6 takes place above the final 2D section of Act 2, in a level constructed entirely out of blocks and floating platforms. Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 2, and they don't even try to hide it. Act 2 was split into Acts 3 and 5, and likewise it's pretty obvious. Act 4 is a remix of the final 2D section of Act 2, and this is the first instance of a side mission being played before its respective main act, and given that nobody likes these laser cannons, it's unfortunate that a player's first impression of this stage is and only afterwards do they get to experience something a little more like Sonic Speed. Act 6 is a remix of the first 2D section of Act 1, focusing on these yellow blocks which, as of forces, have been given the name of Reverse Block. Okay then. Act 1 is Act 1, there's nothing more to it, there's a nice bookends thing going on here with the way the stage ends like it begins. Too bad it's almost completely automated, same goes for Act 2, which is just simply placed in Act 5. That makes this the only zone in the game where both original full-length acts are kept intact. Moving on. Act 1's side missions are each remixes of the two 2D sections. The first, Act 2, has a heavy focus on the cube wisp and these bomb blocks, while the second, Act 4, features these plasma cannons, once again named as of forces, and a bit with the frenzy wisp replacing the section with a giant crushing ceiling. Acts 3 and 6 are remixes of the 2D section of Act 2. Act 3 has the spring that's fun, and Act 6 has these invincible metal spinner enemies and a name that has absolutely nothing to do with the stage itself. Act 1 was split into Acts 3 and 4. While the split isn't super obvious, you can actually see the beginning of Act 4 in the cliffside at the end of Act 1. I'm not fully certain how the two might have connected originally, but given it's a construction site, I like to imagine this connection was canonically left unfinished. Act 2 was moved to Act 6. Acts 2 and 3 together make a remix of Act 1, from the beginning of the first 2D section up until where Act 4 begins, the first featuring the sprinklers again, and the second Aero Chasers. Act 5 is a remix of the 2D section of Act 2 featuring the reverse blocks and, once again, is played before the main act. Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 4, and it's not the most graceful of splits. Act 4 begins on this rock at the end of Act 1, but you can actually jump back into the pool that is the end of Act 1 and take a drill wisp through a pipe, which you'll see if you load it in Act 1 is just blocked off by a block. Basically, you're forced to backtrack to take this alternate route, which wouldn't have been the case had this split not been made, which is a shame because this could have been one of the best stages in the entire game had its full length been realised. Act 2 was moved to Act 6. It may seem a little odd since it begins and ends in a relatively slow underwater 2D section with this fish gimmick that lets Sonic swim, but it has a rather substantial 3D section in the middle, which I consider to be the criteria that indicates which acts are the main acts of each zone. Now, the side mission, which is placed in Act 2 in the final game, is set in a 2D section of the original Act 2, and what I find rather interesting is how it's entirely possible to miss this when playing Act 6 in the final game, and considering you play the full act after playing the side mission, it's kind of like by going off the beaten path, you find this area that looks like a level you already played, and it's like, wow, that's neat. Acts 3 and 5 are set in the first 2D section of Act 1 and are kinda like opposites. Act 3 is a remix of this area where it's mandatory to go briefly underwater, and Act 5 is high above on this moving spring again. Oh, good. Act 1 was split into Acts 1 and 2, and Act 2 was moved to Act 6. There's quite the gap where this split was made. Maybe something must have launched Sonic over there, like maybe just more of these asteroids, probably. Yeah, that's probably it. All the side missions are set in Act 1. 3 and 5 are set in the final 2D section, throwing every kind of gimmick it can all at once, and Act 4 is just looping around these rings until you hit an arbitrary place switch. Next. Act 1 is Act 1, Act 2 is Act 2. Actually, in the music files there appears to be tracks names that correspond to a possible Act 3 like the rest of the zones. The main track is just that ambient noise that is played when Act 2 is loading, but the filtered version, the one used when Sonic is boosting, is actually a version of Act 1's music, but sounds considerably different. I won't play it here because all we have left is the one that has the filter that isn't exactly easy on the ears, but it seems to be the same song but with a different recording that has a different nuance in the way it's played. Okay, just a little bit so you know what I mean. Okay, that's enough, let's finish this up. I think it's fair to say we have a pretty clear idea of what Sonic Colors may have looked like in an early iteration. So that leaves the question of, why do all this? Why split up these perfectly functional levels that were comparable to the highly regarded day stages of Unleashed, and then mix in the more experimental and gimmicky side missions amongst them and make them mandatory within a single playthrough, all while making them harder to identify amongst the main stages? I think quite simply, they just wanted to make the game longer. The mentality that resulted in the existence of non-Sonic stuff being put into Sonic games ever since the adventure days with the likes of Gamma and the Werehog and Shadow's branching paths and alternate endings, in the name of extending playtime in a full-price game almost certainly affected colours, but because the game ended up being short regardless, most people don't think of it to be the case with this game. It's kinda clever, but amongst all the inconsistent pacing, intrusive gimmicks, and the now prevailing opinion amongst the community that this game just doesn't hold up as well as it once did and barely qualifies as a 3D game, is it all really worth it just to turn a 1 hour long game into a 2 hour long game? Well, that's not my job to answer that, so what's my final conclusion on all this then? Play Sonic Colors on DS. It has a structure that makes sense, 2 acts per zone with optional side missions, it does pretty much everything the Wii version should have done. Okay, I'm done. The Wii version's still good though. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. This is my first time really doing something like this, so I'm sure there's things I could improve about how I've gone about recording and editing and all that. Truthfully, I really just wanted to address those misconceptions, and when I learned beyond any doubt that the game was going to have longer, more traditional levels, as opposed to the shorter ones that are now a common point of criticism that even I agree with, I just had to get the word out. There's still a lot I do love about this game. I mean, being the first game I played since becoming a Sonic fan probably has something to do with it, but it's promising that this one aspect of the game that I don't exactly agree with nowadays has a logical explanation and history behind it. Maybe if we ever see this game re-released, we could see these levels restored to their former unseen glory, and if not, well, we've seen what the community can do. Anyway, that's all from me, and for those who have learned something from me who document this kind of stuff, well, I've already done the research for you. Feel free to put my findings out there. Just link back here if you do. I'd really appreciate it. Okay, bye.